There's a place tucked into the hills just north of Dunedin in New Zealand that still sends a shiver down the spine. While it's eerily quiet now, 75 or 100 years ago, it was anything but quiet. It was a place of screams, torment, severe mental health issues, and shocking methods of treatment. This was Seacliff Lunatic Asylum. Opened in 1879, Seacliff was once the largest building in New Zealand, a massive fortress of stone built to house those deemed unwanted. It was intended for people with mental illness, epilepsy, trauma, grief, poverty, and sometimes even for women who just spoke a little bit too loudly. The past everybody. It was essentially anyone who didn't quite fit into society. In its early days, Seacliff wasn't conceived as a tool of cruelty. It was promoted as a beacon of hope, a modern solution to the outdated madhouses of the past. However, what on paper looked like genuine progress quickly morphed into a monstrous reality. Within just a few years, the institution began to rot from the inside. Take your pick, from overcrowding, incompetence, abuse passed off as treatment, and even structural problems, all of which meant that this stone Goliath was a rickety sham from the very start. Then came the fire in 1942, a locked ward where dozens of women burned alive while staff scrambled to find the right keys. This was a horrendous horror show that simply refused to end. Just before we continue with today's episode, a quick word from our sponsor, Surfshark. Look, if you're still connecting to public Wi-Fi without a VPN, you might as well just hand over your data to malicious actors. Surfshark, though, they encrypt your internet traffic, masking your IP and letting you browse privately, even if you're on that dodgy hotel Wi-Fi that doesn't have a password and you're like, is this really safe? And the answer's no. But use Surfshark and you'll be fine. You could also switch your virtual location to access content from almost anywhere, so you can avoid price discrimination on flights, or just, I don't know, keep your online habits to yourself like they're supposed to be. Why? ISPs, why do you need to know what I'm doing? Just leave me alone. Just let me browse the internet in privacy. Come on. So go to surfshark.com/places or use the code PLACES at checkout and you'll get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN for free. That's surfshark.com/places, code PLACES. And now back to today's episode. Seacliff was supposed to be different, a new kind of asylum, modern, humane, progressive. And in many ways, it actually was. The thing to remember here is that we often look back at relatively recent history with revulsion, wondering how we could have ever done such things. Yet this perspective overlooks the fact that despite all of its horror, Seacliff was actually an improvement on what had come before. Throughout human history, those with mental health issues were frequently treated in appalling ways, and the mid-1800s was absolutely no exception. Mental health wasn't really seen as an illness. It was more often regarded as a nuisance or even a moral failing on the part of the family. And the treatment, if you want to call it treatment, reflected this disturbing reality. The mentally ill were often chained to walls or beds, locked in isolation for days or even weeks. Standard methods included cold water immersion, dunking patients into freezing baths to shock the madness out of them, and spinning chairs designed to disorient and exhaust. If you were agitated, you were sedated with whatever was available: opium, alcohol, restraint, sometimes even a truncheon to the back of the head. Electroconvulsive therapy, crude and unregulated, was beginning to make an appearance, often administered without consent or even a basic understanding from the patient. And if you were too far gone, they'd sometimes drill into your skull to let the madness escape, leaving you a dribbling, helpless mess for the rest of your life. Gradually, however, social acceptance began to turn against these methods, and the madhouses where the mentally ill were dumped. In the mid-1800s, New Zealand prided itself on being progressive, a social laboratory of the British Empire. Many believed that patients suffering from mental health issues should be treated with kindness and given structure, fresh air, and a chance at recovery. But this ideal could only be realized with sufficient funding, properly trained staff, and political will, resources that New Zealand sorely lacked. Facilities were few, resources were stretched thin, and oversight was pretty much non-existent. So while official policy began to shift toward compassion, the reality remained one of cold baths, locked doors, and too many patients crammed into far too few rooms. Then, though, came the idea of Seacliff. It marked a step toward a new era, a grand and dramatic setting where those suffering from mental health issues could be housed. The man behind the concept was architect Robert Lawson, a Scottish transplant with big ideas and, as it turns out, even bigger flaws. Seacliff Asylum was situated on the rugged coast northeast of Dunedin in Essold among forests and scrub, far enough from the city to remain unseen. And that was the point. Seacliff's story began during the Gold Rush era, when a booming Otago population overwhelmed Dunedin's fragile infrastructure, including its mental health facilities. In response, construction of a new asylum commenced in 1874, although the main building remained incomplete when it officially opened in 1884. This detail is significant when considering what followed. Much of Seacliff was built by those that it was meant to house. This grand megalith was constructed by the same mentally ill patients who would eventually call this place jail. I mean home, not jail. Why would you call it jail? We'll see. There's a sort of wacky absurdity to that fact, isn't there, which played a major role in Seacliff's downfall, quite literally. You see, Robert Lawson endowed Seacliff with its grandeur, massive wings, arched windows, high ceilings. But he made a fundamental error. He didn't test the land. The entire structure was built on unstable soil, and within a few years, cracks began to form. Floors sloped, walls buckled, and parts of the asylum were literally sinking into the ground. But look, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. When Seacliff opened in 1884, it was seen as a positive step, designed to house 500 patients. Within a decade, that number had doubled, and the expansion did not stop there. By the 1940s, over 1,200 people were crammed into a facility never meant to bear such a load. Rooms built for 5 held 10. Beds were shoved into corridors, hygiene was appalling, and the staff were underpaid, overworked, and largely simply unqualified. Now, if you were a patient at Seacliff, your day didn't begin with therapy or sunlight streaming through lace curtains. It began with routine, cold, loud, impersonal. You'd wake up in a cramped ward, often sharing a room with more people than there were beds. If you were lucky, you got a mattress. If you weren't lucky, you were on the floor. Breakfast was basic, watery porridge, weak tea, and perhaps some bread if you were really, really lucky. Then work began, and it was not optional. Patients were used for labor, gardening, washing, construction, and even helping in the kitchen. While some of this work was framed as therapeutic, let's be honest about it. Free labor was always welcome. And if you didn't believe, and if you didn't work or you didn't behave, well, you got punished, didn't you? Treatments weren't treatments, at least in a 21st century sense of the word. In many ways, things were exactly the same as in other institutions that Seacliff was meant to improve upon. Cold water immersion, extended isolation, straitjackets. Electroconvulsive therapy became more common in the 20th century, and even if it didn't help, at least it made the patients compliant and docile, more vegetable than human. Because really, that was the goal, wasn't it? To keep them quiet, manageable, and invisible. The diagnoses were equally chilling and far-reaching. There was a time when being depressed or grieving could land you in an asylum. Epilepsy was seen as a mental defect, and women were frequently admitted for hysteria, a diagnosis that could refer to anything from postnatal depression to simply daring to have an opinion. God forbid. Once inside, getting out was not easy. Appeals were rare, reviews infrequent, and for many, Seacliff was the last stop. Famed New Zealand writer Janet Frame was held in Seacliff after being misdiagnosed with schizophrenia. She later wrote, "The attitude of those in charge, who unfortunately wrote the reports and influenced the treatment, was that of reprimand and punishment, with certain forms of medical treatment being threatened as punishment for failure to cooperate, and where not cooperate might mean a refusal to obey an order, say to go to the doorless lavatories with 6 others and urinate in public while suffering verbal abuse by the nurse for being unwilling." Too fussy, are we? Well, miseducated, you'll learn a thing or two here. Now, reports from the staff, at least from those who spoke out, describe scenes that wouldn't be out of place in prison. Overcrowded dorms, bites, and patients being restrained for hours or days with no medical oversight at all. Hygiene was laughable, and diseases spread quickly. Lice, scabies, and infections were constant companions, yet official records often painted a much calmer, rosier picture, because of course they did. There was also the issue of abuse. Physical abuse was certainly evident. Verbal abuse occurred routinely. Sexual abuse was very likely, though it was rarely documented and almost never punished. Staff turnover was high, and training shockingly minimal. Forget background checks to ensure safety with vulnerable populations. The workers weren't there out of compassion, they were there because it was a job in an isolated area that didn't invite too many questions. Among the darkest practices at Seacliff were the so-called Unsexing Operations. These were surgical procedures designed to strip away sexuality, especially in women. The rationale behind these interventions, if one could call them that, was rooted in Victorian-era pseudoscience, which posited that reproductive organs were linked to hysteria, disobedience, or excessive emotion. If a woman was deemed too sexual, too outspoken, or too difficult, the solution, it wasn't therapy, it was surgery. In some instances, these procedures involved full hysterectomies, in others, oophorectomies, the removal of ovaries. There were no issues of cancer or tumors, only diagnoses such as nervous instability, moral insanity, or nymphomania. Men weren't exempt either. Some were castrated to cure sexual deviance, especially if they were homosexual or had been accused of assault, often without any trial or any evidence. The most harrowing aspect of these practices was that they were not framed as punishment. They were framed as treatment. Consent wasn't a factor. Most patients didn't even understand what was being done to them. They were simply told that the procedure would make them calmer, stop the headaches, and it was absolutely necessary. It was mutilation wrapped in clinical language, and it was not rare. Records show dozens of such procedures performed across New Zealand's asylums in the early 20th century, with some patients being operated on more than once. Just 3 years after it opened, cracks began to appear in the walls literally. Planners had warned about the risk of a landslide and the structural effects on Seacliff, and in February 1887, those warnings came to pass when a major landslide hit the area. Floors shifted, doors jammed, walls leaned at odd angles, and the entire structure groaned under its own weight. Robert Lawson, the celebrated architect behind Seacliff, had designed it to be grand and imposing, but he made a fatal miscalculation. The building sat on that unstable ground we mentioned earlier, a mix of clay and sand. It was never meant to hold such massive weight. And in 1888, the failures were undeniable. Parts of the complex were visibly sinking and the foundations were buckling. A Royal Commission of Inquiry was launched, not to investigate what was happening inside, but to determine why the building itself was collapsing. The findings were damning. The commission confirmed what residents and staff already knew. Seacliff was dangerous, and entire wings were structurally unsound. The blame fell primarily on Lawson, whose reputation never fully recovered, and also on the government, which had rushed construction without conducting soil tests or ensuring proper oversight. There were also the whispered accusations that because much of the building had been constructed by patients capable of assisting, it hadn't exactly been built to a high standard. The grandly imposing stone castle-like structure was in reality a shambolic house of cards teetering on the verge of disaster. And as all good governments do, the New Zealand government quickly raised its hand, admitted to its mistake, and began rectifying the situation. No, they didn't. That's not what happened. As most governments do, the matter was put under the rug, and everybody did their best to pretend that nothing had ever happened. Despite repeated warnings, shockingly, they continued using the structure. Rather than rebuilding or relocating, they sealed off the most dangerous sections and transferred patients to other parts of the facility. People continued to live, suffer, and die inside a building that had been declared unstable. The worst day in Seacliff's history occurred in 1942, and it began like any other day, identical corridors and routine, but around midnight, a fire kicked off in Ward 5, a locked room that housed 39 female patients. The issue, however, wasn't merely the fire itself. Fires, they happen. The real problem was what ensued. The women were trapped inside, and most of the staff were tucked away in their beds far away from the scene. A skeleton crew was on duty that night, but when the staff attempted to unlock the door, they couldn't locate the keys. As flames rapidly spread and smoke poured in, screams echoed down the corridor. By the time the door was finally opened, 37 of the women had already perished. It remains one of the worst institutional disasters in New Zealand's history, yet it was brushed off as an unfortunate accident. The official inquiry blamed faulty wiring and staff confusion. There was no criminal negligence, no sweeping reform, just a shrug from those in charge and a quiet push to move on. The bodies were buried in a mass grave, no markings, no names. And the building? Patched up. Business as usual. Remarkably, Seacliff limped on for another 30 years after the fire. The cracks worsened, the staff dwindled, and for the most part, the public looked away. By the 1970s, mental health policy in New Zealand was slowly shifting. Institutions were falling out of favour, and community care became the new buzzword. Seacliff was finally closed in 1973, but by then the place had become a crumbling relic. Patients were moved to Cherry Farm, a newer facility nearby. Some improved, some didn't. Others simply faded into the next institution, becoming just another file. Another number in the system. Today, little of Seacliff remains except a few stone walls and the foundations of what was once the grandest building in the country. Trees have reclaimed most of it, and if you know where to look, you'll find a small plaque. But that's about it. It's an uncomfortable name in the area, and many still remember the stories, families who avoid mentioning what happened to their relatives behind those walls. There's an undeniable unease in how swiftly we moved on. Seacliff wasn't just a failed asylum, it was a monumental failure in almost every sense.